At first, everything seemed normal for a man who believed he had made it in life. His routine was smooth until a simple detail on the street caught his attention. The eyes he met made the past come rushing back with brutal force. In that instant, all his success lost its meaning. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us what city you're watching from. And now, our story. December in New York City always had a certain magic for Robert Taylor. The lights starting to decorate Park Avenue, the bustling crowds on, the sidewalks, the scent of roasted chestnuts from the street carts. It all reminded him of a time when life was simpler. But on that Monday afternoon, exactly 5 days before Christmas, the magic transformed into something entirely different. Something he could never have imagined. Robert was driving his luxury sedan down Lexington Avenue, returning from another successful business meeting. At 43, he had built a tech empire, rising from a humble neighborhood in Queens to become one of the most respected entrepreneurs in the city. His life was a series of achievements: a penthouse on the Upper East Side, a high-end car, international trips. Everything he had once promised himself as a boy sleeping on a mattress on his mother's floor. The light turned red at the corner of 65th Street. Robert sighed, glancing at the dashboard clock. He still had time to stop by the club before his dinner with investors. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel while he waited, idly watching the pedestrians in the crosswalk. It was then that his eyes caught an image that nearly stopped his heart. An elderly woman with disheveled grey hair was walking between the cars with her hand outstretched. She wore a faded blouse, a dirty skirt, and was barefoot. Her feet, swollen and scarred by the hot asphalt, stepped carefully between the vehicles. The woman approached each driver with a downcast, ashamed look, asking for a few coins in a nearly inaudible voice. Robert felt a strange pang in his chest. There was something about that figure that deeply disturbed him. It wasn't just the sight of poverty itself, all too common on the streets of New York, but an unsettling familiarity he couldn't place. The woman approached the car next to his. Robert turned his head, trying to get a better look at her face. And then it happened. The woman lifted her eyes for a brief moment, seeking the gaze of the driver next to her, and Robert saw. He saw the brown eyes that had comforted him so many times as a child. He saw the wrinkles around the mouth that formed when she smiled. He saw the small birthmark on her neck that he used to touch when he was a baby. His entire body froze. No, it couldn't be, but it was. That woman begging for change in the middle of Lexington Avenue, barefoot and in rags, was Joan Taylor, his mother. The light turned green, but Robert couldn't move the car. Horns started blaring behind him, impatient, but his feet felt like lead. He watched his mother approach another vehicle, saw the driver's refusal, saw her lower her head and move on. Robert's eyes burned. This couldn't be happening. With trembling hands, he opened the car door just as she was passing in front of his bumper. Joan looked up, startled by the sudden movement. Her eyes met Robert's, and it was as if time stood still. Her face transformed into pure terror, not relief, not joy. Terror and shame. "Robert, my son," she whispered, her voice breaking. No, you shouldn't see me like this." She tried to pull away, but Robert gently held her by the arm. The honking grew louder, drivers yelling at him to get out of the way. But none of it mattered. Nothing in the world mattered except the woman standing before him. "Mom, what's going on? How are you? Why are you here?" Joan tried to hide the coin she was clutching, as if that could undo reality. Tears streamed down her dirty face, leaving clean tracks on her sun-weathered skin. She shook her head, unable to form words. A traffic cop approached, ordering Robert to move his car. He didn't even hear him. He pulled his mother to the sidewalk, leaving the car stopped in the middle of the avenue, keys still in the ignition. Another driver honked so hard that Robert finally reacted, running back to grab the car and quickly park it on the side of the road, in a no-parking zone. It didn't matter. Nothing else mattered. When he got back to the sidewalk, Joan was leaning against a lamppost, trembling. It wasn't from the cold. It was a muggy New York December day, but she was shaking as if it were the dead of winter. Robert took off his suit jacket and placed it over her shoulders. She tried to refuse, but he insisted. "Mum, tell me what's happening. Please." Joan wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Her eyes held a sadness so profound that Robert felt as if someone was squeezing his chest. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. The words struggled to come out. "I didn't want you to know, son. I didn't want to be a bother." "A bother?" Robert repeated, incredulous. "Mum, you're on the street. What do you mean, a bother?" She looked away, focusing on a random spot on the ground. "Your life, son. You're always so busy. I didn't want to be another problem." Robert felt his legs go weak. He leaned against the lamppost next to her, trying to process those words. Busy. Problem. How had his mother reached a point where she believed needing help was being a bother? "Mom, I send money every month. Mark told me everything was fine, that you were living with him, that you were being taken care of." At the mention of her younger son's name, Joan closed her eyes. A pained expression crossed her face, but she said nothing. Robert pressed on, his voice rising. "He said you were fine. He said—" "Your brother Mark has his own expenses, son. He tried to help, but—" "Tried to help?" Robert interrupted, feeling anger build. "Mom, where are you living?" Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Joan clutched the jacket against her body as if it could shield her from the truth. "Mom, answer me. Where are you living?" "I get by, son. I stay a few days at a friend's house, a few days somewhere else. God always provides." Robert felt the world spin. He turned his back, running his hands through his hair, taking a deep breath to keep from exploding right there on the sidewalk. His mother was homeless. The woman who raised him alone, who worked double shifts so he could study, who sold her own wedding ring to pay his tuition for trade school, was begging for change at a traffic light. And he knew nothing. "I call Mark every week," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Every week he tells me everything's under control, that you're fine, that you don't need anything. Your brother didn't want to worry you, Robert. You have your own life, your responsibilities." "No." Robert turned sharply to face her. "Don't give me that. You're my mother. My biggest responsibility is you." Joan began to cry for real now, deep sobs that shook her frail body. Robert pulled her into a clumsy hug, feeling how thin she was, almost just bone. How long had she been like this? How long had his mother been invisible to the world while he was celebrating multi-million-dollar contracts? "We're going home," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My home. Now." "No, son, I can't." "Yes, you can, and you will." Robert took out his phone and called his driver. He asked him to go to his address, pick up clean clothes, shoes, and towels. Then he called his housekeeper, instructing her to prepare the guest room immediately. Joan tried to protest again, but he wouldn't listen. His mind was made up. While they waited for the driver to arrive with the items, Robert asked more questions. Slowly, between pauses and tears, the story began to unfold. Joan had been living with Mark for 2 years, after selling her own house in Astoria. Mark had convinced her it would be better that way, that he would take care of her, that Robert was too far away to worry about these things. At first it seemed to work. Mark managed the money Robert sent monthly, bought groceries, paid the bills, but gradually things started to change. The money was no longer enough. Joan was told to eat less, spend less, ask for less. When she tried to call Robert, Mark would say he was stressed, too busy, that it was better not to bother him with small things. And she believed him. She believed him because she didn't want to be a burden, because she had already been a burden her whole life, because she thought she deserved less. 3 months ago, Mark said he needed money for an emergency. He used what Robert had sent and promised to pay it back. He never did. The next month, he said things were tough and that she would need to stay with a neighbor for a few days. She went. She waited for him to call, her back. He never did. Joan began to drift between embarrassing favors and makeshift shelters, always believing it was temporary, always thinking she was being a bother, always hoping her distant son wouldn't find out, until the favors ran out, until there was nowhere else to go, and the street became the last resort. Robert listened to it all with a lump in his throat that felt like it was choking him. How had he not noticed? How had he let things get to this point? He remembered the weekly calls with Mark, always quick, always superficial. "Is Mom okay?" "Yeah, bro, everything's cool." And Robert accepted it. He simply accepted it and went back to his meetings, his business, his comfortable life. The driver arrived with the clothes. Robert took his mother to a nearby public restroom, waiting outside while she changed. When she came out, still thin and frail, but at least dressed with dignity, he felt a pang in his heart. She looked so small, so lost. On the way to the apartment, Joan was silent, staring out the car window. Robert tried to make conversation a few times, but gave up. There was so much to be said, so much pain to be processed, that words seemed inadequate. When they arrived at the building on the Upper East Side, the doorman looked at Joan with a poorly disguised expression of suspicion. Robert shot him a sharp glare that made the man immediately lower his head. In the elevator, his mother clutched her old purse to her chest, as if afraid of dirtying something. "You can relax, Mom. This is your home now." She just nodded, but Robert could see she didn't believe it. Not yet. The apartment was immaculate, as always. The housekeeper had prepared everything, as requested. Joan entered slowly, taking in every detail with wide eyes. It was a world completely different from the one she had lived in her entire life. Robert guided her to the guest room, showed her the bathroom, and offered her a hot shower. When she closed the bedroom door, Robert finally let the tears fall. He leaned against the hallway wall and cried silently, years of absence weighing on his shoulders. Then he wiped his face and picked up his phone. He dialed his brother's number. Mark answered on the third ring, his voice far too casual. "Hey, bro, what's up?" Robert took a deep breath, controlling the fury boiling inside him. "I found our mother today, Mark, at the light on Lexington, barefoot, begging for money." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Robert continued, his voice low but charged with contained rage. "I'm coming over tomorrow, and you're going to explain every single cent of the money I sent you for the last 2 years. Every single cent." He hung up before his brother could respond. His hands were shaking. He looked at the closed door of the room where his mother was, imagining the horrors she had endured, while he believed everything was fine. Christmas was coming. The city lights were shining outside, but inside him there was only darkness and a pain he didn't know how to heal. "Are you enjoying this story? Tell me your opinion on it and how you think it will end." The night fell over New York with the same intensity as the silence that fell inside Robert's apartment. Joan had been out of the shower for almost an hour, wearing the plush robe he had left for her. But she hadn't come into the living room yet. Robert waited on the sofa, staring at the cup of cold coffee on the center table, unable to drink anything while his mind endlessly processed everything he had discovered. The housekeeper, Maria, had prepared a light dinner and left everything ready before she went home. She didn't ask any questions, but Robert saw the concern in her eyes as she passed through the living room. It was impossible not to notice that something very serious was happening. When the bedroom door finally opened, Robert jumped to his feet. Joan appeared in the hallway, walking with slow, hesitant steps. She was wearing a pair of sweatpants and a blouse that Maria had set aside from her own clothes, since Robert's would have been far too big. Even clean, with her hair combed, she still looked lost, as if she didn't quite know where she was, or if she had permission to be there. "Did you eat anything?" Robert asked, trying to sound as natural as possible. Joan shook her head. "I'm not hungry, son." "Mom, you need to eat. Come on, I'll heat up the food." "Don't bother, Robert. I've been enough of a bother today." That word again. Bother. Robert felt his blood boil, but he controlled his irritation. He wasn't angry with her. He was angry with the situation, with his brother, with himself. "You're not bothering anyone. This is your home. Now come have dinner with me, please." She obeyed, but Robert noticed how every movement was laden with hesitation. In the kitchen, she sat on the edge of a chair, her hands folded in her lap, watching as he heated the plate Maria had prepared. Beef stroganoff with rice, one of her favorite dishes, he remembered. Did she still like it? When he placed the plate in front of her, Joan looked at the food with an expression that broke Robert's heart. It was as if she were calculating whether she deserved it. She picked up her fork slowly and ate small bites, chewing slowly, almost reverently. Robert served himself too, more for company than out of hunger. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the clinking of silverware echoing in the modern, spacious kitchen. It was a heavy silence, full of unsaid things, of questions that needed to be asked but that neither of them knew how to begin. "Tomorrow I'm going to get your things," Robert finally said. "Whatever is left at Mark's house, your clothes, documents, everything." Joan stopped eating, her fork suspended in mid-air. "Son, you don't need to cause any trouble. I don't have much anyway." "It's not trouble, Mum. It's your stuff. You have a right to it." She put her fork back on the plate, her appetite clearly gone. "Robert, your brother tried to help. He's not a bad person. It's just that things got hard for him too." "Hard?" Robert repeated, his voice rising without him being able to control it. "Mum, you were on the street, barefoot, begging for money, and he called me every week saying everything was fine." "Don't raise your voice, son. Your brother has his own family to support." "And what about you?" Robert slammed his hand on the table, making the plates rattle. "Aren't you family? Don't you deserve to be supported?" Joan shrank in her chair, her eyes welling up. Robert immediately regretted his tone. He ran a hand over his face, taking a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to yell. But you need to understand that this isn't right. None of this is right." She wiped a tear with her napkin. "I know, son, I know, but Mark has always been more complicated. You know how he is." Robert knew. Mark had always been the problem child, the one who got into trouble, who could never hold down a job for long. When Robert moved to the city for work, Mark stayed in Queens close to their mother. At the time, it seemed like the right decision. Someone needed to be nearby. But now, Robert understood that proximity didn't mean care. "Tell me what happened, Mom, from the beginning, please." Joan took a deep breath, looking down at her hands. She began to speak slowly, her voice weak but steady. She told him how Mark had suggested she sell the house in Astoria and move in with him. He said it would be better for her not to be alone, that he would take care of everything. Robert was sending money monthly, enough to cover all her expenses with plenty to spare. At the time, it seemed like a good idea. "In the beginning, it was good," she continued. "Mark bought everything I needed. He even took me to the doctor when I had to go. But after a few months, he started saying the money wasn't enough, that things were expensive, that I ate too much, spent too much on medicine." Robert clenched his fists. "How much was I sending a month?" $2,000. $2,000, Robert repeated slowly. That was more than enough to cover everything, food, medicine, some extra. What did he do with that money? Joan shook her head. He said he had debts, that he was behind on rent, that Jessica, his wife, was sick and needed treatment. There was always something. Robert knew Jessica. She had. Never been sick. She worked at a salon, was always fine, always spending money on clothes and makeup on social media. He felt the anger rise again, but took a deep breath to stay calm. And when did it start getting really bad? Joan closed her eyes, as if trying not to remember. About 4 months ago. Mark said he had to use that month's money for an emergency. He promised to pay it back. I didn't press him. The next month, he said you were late with the payment. I believed him. I was never late, Mom. Never. I know that now, son. But at the time I didn't. I started skipping meals to save money. I stopped buying my medicine. I thought it was my fault that I was spending too much. Robert wanted to punch a wall. How could Mark have the nerve to do that? How could he lie to a woman who had always done everything for her children? And then he asked you to leave his house? Joan shook her head, more tears streaming down. He said it was just for a few days, that his mother-in-law was coming to stay and there wasn't enough room. He asked me to stay with Mrs. Davis, a neighbor. I went. I stayed there for almost a month, helping her with chores in exchange for a place to stay. When I went back to Mark's, he said the situation was complicated now, that it would be better if I found another place. And you didn't call me? You didn't tell me any of this? How could I call, son? Mark said you were super stressed with work, that you had just closed a big deal and that any problem could mess things up for you. He said he would fix it, that I just had to wait a little longer. Robert ran his hands over his face, trying to hold back tears of anger and frustration. Mark had completely isolated their mother. He controlled the information, manipulated the situation, made her believe that Robert couldn't be bothered while he siphoned off the money that was supposed to be for her care. And after Mrs. Davis, Joan took a deep breath. I stayed for another week at another friend's house. Then I went back to Mark's, but he wouldn't let me in. He said he had rented a room for me in a boarding house, but he needed money. I didn't have any. I started sleeping in shelters. Some of them take women my age, but you have to get there early, and there isn't always a spot. Her voice broke completely. Robert got up and went to her, kneeling beside the chair and holding her hands. They were cold, trembling slightly. Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you tell me the truth? Because I was ashamed, son, she sobbed. Ashamed of being a burden, ashamed that I couldn't manage on my own, ashamed for you to see me like that. You were never a burden, never. And I should have noticed, I should have come to visit, I should have talked to you personally and not just to Mark. They stayed like that for a few minutes, her crying and him trying to comfort her, knowing that no words would be enough to erase the pain of the last few months. When she finally calmed down, Robert helped her up. Go get some rest, Mum. We'll sort everything out tomorrow. She nodded and went back to her room. Robert stayed in the kitchen, looking at the half-eaten plates. He picked up his phone and opened his messages. There were several from Mark, all sent after their earlier phone call. Most were apologies, attempts at explanation, pleas for Robert to understand his side of the story. Robert didn't reply to any of them. Instead, he opened the old conversations between him and his brother. He reread months of lies. Is Mom okay? Yeah, bro, everything's cool. Does she need anything? Nah, she's good. Can you send a little extra this month? Sure, no problem. All the times Robert had sent extra money, trusting that he was helping his mother. All the times Mark had assured him she was well cared for. All the lies piled up one on top of the other, while Joan slowly disappeared into the city's invisibility. Robert barely slept that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, planning what he would say to his brother the next day. He wanted to scream, to fight, to make him pay for every moment of suffering he caused their mother. But more than that, he wanted answers. He wanted to understand how someone could do that to their own mother. In the middle of the night, he got up for a glass of water and passed by Joan's room. He saw a sliver of light from under the door. He knocked gently. Mom, is everything okay? You can come in, son. She was sitting up in bed, hugging a pillow, her eyes red from crying. Robert sat beside her. Can't sleep? She shook her head. I'm afraid I'll wake up and find out this was all a dream, that I'm still on the street. Robert's heart ached. He held her hand. It's not a dream, Mom. You're here. You're safe. And you're staying. She rested her head on his shoulder, and the two of them sat like that for a long time in silence. Robert felt the weight of all the years he had spent away, of all the quick phone calls, of all the Christmases he had spent on trips, instead of with his family. Success, he'd always thought, was about making money, gaining status, building a name for himself. But in that moment, holding his mother, whom he had almost lost to the invisibility of the streets, he understood that he had failed at what mattered most. When the sun rose over New York the next morning, Robert was already up and dressed. He had coffee alone, let Joan rest, and left the apartment with a clear objective. He drove out to Queens, to the neighborhood of Flushing, where Mark lived in a simple but well-kept house. He parked across the street and watched for a few minutes, trying to control the fury bubbling inside him. When he finally knocked on the door, it was Jessica who opened it. She turned pale when she saw Robert. "Hey, Rob," she stammered. "Mark's not here." "Yes, he is," Robert replied, pushing the door, open and walking in. Mark appeared in the living room, a defensive expression on his face. "We need to talk," Robert said, his voice low but thick with contained anger. Mark crossed his arms. "Look, bro, I know you're mad, But you don't understand the whole situation. Then explain it to me. Explain how my mother ended up on the street while I was sending you $2,000 a month to take care of her." Jessica tried to interject. "Things got tough, Robert. We had expenses." "Expenses?" Robert looked around the room. He saw the new 50-inch TV. He saw the sofa that was clearly recent. He saw Jessica's expensive clothes hanging on the line in the laundry area. "What kind of expenses?" Mark took a step forward, trying to sound firm. "I have a family to support too. It's not just Mom who needs money." "And you thought it was right to use her money to buy your things," Robert pointed to the TV, "to live it up while she was starving. It wasn't like that. I was going to pay it all back. It was just temporary." "Temporary? She was on the street, Mark. On the street. And you called me every week telling me everything was fine." Mark looked down, finally showing some sign of shame. "I didn't want it to get to that point. But it did. And now you're going to explain every cent, and you're going to pay back what you can." Robert stepped closer, staring his brother in the eyes. "And if I find out you sold anything that was hers, if I find out you touched her documents, any of her property, I won't have any mercy." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but Robert had already turned his back and left the house. He didn't want to hear any more excuses, more lies, more attempts to justify the unjustifiable. He got back in his car and drove back to his apartment, his hands gripping the steering wheel, Christmas approaching, but inner peace feeling further away than ever. The days leading up to Christmas passed in a strange mix of routine and tension inside Robert's apartment. Joan would wake up early every morning, always before sunrise, as if she were still on the street, needing to secure a spot at a shelter. Robert would find her sitting in the living room looking out the window at the city beginning to stir, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for permission to exist. On the third day, he woke up to find her washing dishes in the kitchen. They were the dishes Maria had left to soak the night before, part of her job that she would do when she arrived. "Mom, what are you doing?" Joan was startled by his voice, nearly dropping a plate. "Oh, son, I was just helping. I don't want to be a burden." That word again. Robert walked over and gently took the sponge from her hand. "You don't have to do this. Maria gets paid to take care of the house. But I can't just sit here doing nothing, Robert. I don't feel right." He realized that for her, being idle was equivalent to not deserving to be there. Years of being treated like a burden had taught her that she needed to compensate for her existence with work, with utility, with anything that justified the space she occupied. "Mom, you can do whatever you want here. Read, watch TV, rest. But because you want to, not because you have to. Do you understand the difference?" She nodded, but Robert could see she didn't truly understand. It would be a long road to teach his mother that she had value simply for existing, that she didn't need to earn the right to be cared for. Maria arrived shortly after and was happy to see Joan in the kitchen. The two women, close in age and from similar backgrounds, quickly formed a connection. Maria started keeping Joan company during the day, chatting about everyday life, about soap operas, about old recipes. It was exactly what she needed, Robert thought. Normalcy, human connection without weight, without judgment, without emotional debts. But the nights were still hard. Joan would wake up several times disoriented, trying to recognize where she was. Twice, Robert found her hiding bread and fruit under her pillow, a habit from the street she couldn't shake. When he asked why she did it, she would answer in a shamed voice that it was just a habit, that she couldn't stop. On Christmas Eve, Robert took Joan shopping. He wanted her to pick out new clothes, comfortable shoes, everything she needed. She resisted at first, saying it wasn't necessary, that he had already done too much, but Robert insisted. He needed to do this. He needed to see his mother choosing things for herself, exercising the agency that had been taken from her for so long. At the mall, decorated with Christmas lights and giant trees, Joan walked slowly, looking at everything with a mixture of wonder and discomfort. People rushed past with bags full of gifts. Children ran around excitedly. Christmas music played loudly. It was a world of abundance that contrasted brutally with the months she had spent fighting for coins on the asphalt. When they entered a women's clothing store, the sales associate looked at Joan with that judgmental glance that well-dressed people sometimes give to those who seem not to belong. Robert noticed and narrowed his eyes at the woman, who quickly changed her posture and offered help with a forced smile. "Mum, pick out whatever you want. Don't look at the price, don't worry about anything." Joan touched a navy blue dress, simple but elegant. "It's pretty," she murmured. "Then get it, and get some other things too. Pants, blouses, whatever you want." She chose a few items hesitantly, always the simplest ones, always looking at the price tags with a worried expression. Robert ended up grabbing several other outfits and taking them to the fitting room without asking. When she came out trying on the blue dress, her eyes sparkled for the first time in days. "You look beautiful, Mum." She looked at herself in the mirror, and Robert saw something change in her expression. For a brief moment, she wasn't the woman begging at the traffic light. She was Joan Taylor, a 68-year-old woman who deserved to feel beautiful, who deserved to take up space in the world. They bought several outfits, shoes, and personal care products. Robert paid for everything without a second thought. Money was something he had in abundance. Lost time, on the other hand, could never be recovered. On the way home, they stopped at a diner. Joan ordered only a coffee, but Robert insisted she eat something substantial. While they waited for their order, she looked at him with that expression he was starting to recognize, the look of someone who wants to say something important but doesn't know how to begin. "Go on, Mom." She stirred her coffee, her gaze distant. "I remember when you were little. You were 7, and you saw a family on the street near where we lived. A father, a mother, and 2 kids all sitting on the sidewalk with a cardboard sign asking for help. You pulled my hand and asked why we didn't take them home." Robert vaguely remembered the scene. "I was a kid. I didn't understand how things worked. You said our house was small, but that there was room for more people. You said we could share our food, share the room. You didn't understand why people walked past that family without helping." Joan wiped away a tear. "I explained to you that it wasn't that simple, that everyone had their own problems, their own limitations. And you looked at me with those big eyes and said, 'But Mum, when we have money, we'll help everyone, right? We won't leave anyone alone.'" Her voice broke. "And I look at the man you've become, at everything you've achieved, and I see that you're still that little boy. You didn't leave me alone, Robert. Even without knowing, even from a distance, you always tried to take care of me. What happened wasn't your fault." Robert felt the tears fall. "I should have noticed, Mum. I should have visited more. I should have talked to you instead of just Mark. Don't blame yourself, son. I was at fault too. I accepted less than I deserved. I believed them when they told me I was a bother. I stopped fighting for myself." They sat in silence for a moment, processing everything that had been lost and everything that could still be rebuilt. When they got back to the apartment, there was a message at the front desk. Mark had come by earlier, trying to talk to Robert, but the doorman hadn't let him up without authorization. Robert sighed. He knew that sooner or later he would have to deal with his brother for real, not just with anger and accusations, but with a real conversation. On Christmas morning, Robert woke up early and made breakfast. Maria had left everything organized before leaving to spend the holidays with her family, so it was just him and Joan. She appeared in the kitchen wearing the new dress, her hair done, looking completely different from the woman he had found at the traffic light just a few days ago. "Merry Christmas, Mum." "Merry Christmas, son." They had breakfast together, talking about light subjects. Robert told her about work, about his plans for the next year, about a trip he wanted to take. Joan listened attentively, smiling at the right moments, but he could tell that a part of her was still distant, still processing everything that had happened. After breakfast, Robert handed her a wrapped gift. She opened it carefully as if the paper were too valuable to tear. Inside was a new smartphone, already set up with her number, with his number saved in the contacts. "So you never again feel like you can't call me," he explained. "Any time, any day, for anything. You call me, Mom, promise?" She held the phone with both hands, looking at it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "I promise, son." The rest of the morning passed peacefully. Robert put on a Christmas movie, more for background noise than to actually watch. Joan dozed off on the sofa, finally seeming relaxed. He covered her with a blanket and watched her, thinking about how many Christmases she had spent alone, waiting for calls that never came, holding on to hopes that were constantly dashed. In the early afternoon, the doorbell rang. Robert looked at the intercom and saw Mark on the other side. He was alone without Jessica, his hands in his pockets, and an expression that mixed shame and nervousness. Robert thought about not letting him up. He thought about sending him away, about cutting ties completely. But he looked at his mother sleeping on the sofa and knew he couldn't do that. As much as Mark had messed up, he was still her son, and she, even after everything, still loved him. He let his brother come up. When Mark entered the apartment, he stopped short when he saw his mother on the sofa. His eyes filled with tears. He took a step toward her, but Robert blocked his path. "Let's talk on the balcony," he said quietly, so as not to wake Joan. The two went out to the balcony overlooking Park Avenue. Down below, the city was empty, most people at home celebrating with their families. Mark leaned on the railing, looking down. "I screwed up, bro. I screwed everything up." Robert crossed his arms, waiting. He wasn't going to make it easy for his brother. "At first I really wanted to help," Mark continued. "When she came to live with me, I had plans. I was going to take good care of her, do everything right. But then the bills started piling up. I owe a lot of people, Robert. Gambling, loans, things you can't even imagine." Robert closed his eyes, trying to control his anger. "That doesn't justify it, Mark." I know it doesn't. But it was like an avalanche. I started using a little of the money you sent. Just a little, I thought. Just this month. I'll pay it back next month. But I never did. And then it got harder to admit, harder to tell the truth. "And you thought the solution was to put our mother on the street." Mark turned, tears now streaming freely. "I didn't want it to get to that. I swear to God, I didn't. When I asked her to leave the house, I thought it would be for a few days. I thought I could solve my problems and bring her back. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months." "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you keep lying?" "Because I was ashamed. Because you were always the son who made it, who achieved everything, and I was always the one left behind. How was I supposed to admit that I couldn't even take care of my own mother?" Robert shook his head, weary. "You turned your pride into her suffering. You made our mother believe she was a burden, that she didn't deserve help. Do you understand how serious that is?" Mark covered his face with his hands, sobbing. "I understand, and I'll carry this for the rest of my life." They stood in silence for a long moment. Robert looked at his brother and saw not the villain he had built up in his mind, but a broken, flawed man filled with regret. It didn't erase what he did, didn't justify his choices, but it made everything more complex, more human. "You're going to pay back what you can," Robert said finally, "and you're going to get therapy. You're going to deal with this gambling problem. That's not a suggestion. It's a condition for remaining part of this family." Mark nodded vigorously. "I will. I swear I will. And you're going to apologize to her, for real. Not empty apologies, not promises you won't keep. You're going to look her in the eyes and own up to what you did." "I don't know if I can, bro. I'm so ashamed." "You'll have to. She deserves that." Just then, they heard a noise from the living room. Joan had woken up. She appeared at the balcony door, the blanket still over her shoulders, looking at her two sons. "Mark," she said softly. Her younger son turned, and upon seeing his mother, he broke down. He fell to his knees on the balcony floor, crying like a child. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Joan approached slowly. Robert expected her to scream, to unleash all her accumulated pain and anger, but she simply placed a hand on Mark's head, a gesture she had made 1,000 times when he was little and had nightmares. "Get up, son." "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he sobbed. "It's not about deserving, it's about choosing to move forward." Robert watched the scene with a lump in his throat. His mother, even after everything she had been through, still had compassion. She could still see beyond the pain, could still love even when she had every right to hate. It was a strength he didn't know if he possessed. The three of them stayed on the balcony for a long time that Christmas morning. Mark finally got up, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and looked at his mother with a mixture of gratitude and shame. Robert kept his distance, observing their interaction, still processing the swift forgiveness Joan had offered. Part of him wanted to protest, to say that Mark didn't deserve such easy compassion. But another part, the part that knew his mother deeply, knew that this forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or minimizing. It meant choosing, not to let hatred consume what was left of their family. "Let's have lunch together," Joan said, her voice still weak but firm. "It's Christmas. We're not going to let everything that happened ruin this day, too." Robert was about to object, but he saw the silent plea in her eyes. She needed this. She needed to feel that she could still bring her sons together, that she could still have a moment of family normalcy, however broken, however imperfect. He nodded. Maria had left a seasoned turkey ready to be roasted and several side dishes prepared. Robert put the turkey in the oven while Joan and Mark stayed in the living room, a polite distance between them, talking in low voices about trivial things. The atmosphere was strange, heavy with unresolved tension, but it was better than absolute silence. During lunch, seated at the dining table Robert rarely used, the conversation flowed with difficulty. Joan asked Mark simple questions about Jessica, about his job, about his future plans. He answered in a low voice, avoiding her gaze for too long. Robert ate in silence, not yet ready to treat his brother normally, but respecting the space his mother was creating. It was Joan who broke the uncomfortable silence with a question no one expected. "Do you two remember the Christmas when the refrigerator broke?" Robert and Mark exchanged confused glances. It was a memory so old they had almost forgotten it. "We had just bought the turkey," Joan continued, a small smile on her lips, "and the fridge broke on Christmas Eve. Everything was going to spoil. I cried so much, thinking I'd ruined everything." "I remember," Mark said, his voice soft. "Robert had the idea to barbecue the turkey." "It wasn't a barbecue," Robert corrected, almost smiling. "We roasted it on the neighbor's clay pot stove." Joan laughed, a sound Robert hadn't heard in so long he had almost forgotten what it was like. "And it worked. It was one of the best Christmases we ever had." The silence that followed was different, less heavy, more reflective. It was as if that simple memory had reminded them all that they had once been a real family, that there had been love and laughter and good times before everything fell apart. "I wish we could go back to that time," Mark murmured, "when things were simple." "You can't go back," Robert said, looking at his brother. "But you can build something new, different but new." Joan reached out and touched each of her son's hands. "You two are all I have. I've lost a lot in this life. I lost your father, I lost my health, I lost my home. But I don't want to lose you two. I don't want what happened to me to become a wound that separates my sons forever." Robert looked at his mother and saw the strength hidden beneath her apparent fragility. She had been through so much, had been pushed to the margins of society, had experienced the cruelest invisibility, and yet she still found it in herself to think of her sons, to want to unite them. "I'm not saying everything is okay," he said, choosing his words carefully. "It's not. Mark was wrong, very wrong. But if Mom is willing to give him a chance, then so am I. With conditions." Mark nodded quickly. "Any conditions. I'll do whatever it takes." Robert took out his phone and opened a spreadsheet he had prepared over the last few days. "I calculated how much of the money I sent you used over the past 2 years. $24,000. You're going to pay it back. It doesn't have to be all at once, but it has to be paid. I'll pay it back, bro. Every last cent. And you're going to get counseling for your gambling problem. That's non-negotiable. I already scheduled an appointment. I start next week." Robert put his phone away. "Then we'll try. Slowly, one step at a time." Lunch continued with less tension after that. Not that the problems were solved, not that the pain had disappeared, but there was a path forward, a possibility of rebuilding, however difficult it might be. After lunch, Mark said his goodbyes. He hugged his mother for a long time, whispered another apology, and left the apartment with his shoulders slumped, but with something resembling hope on his face. When the door closed, Joan sighed deeply. "That was hard for you, wasn't it, son? Seeing me forgive him so quickly." Robert nodded. "It was. I'm still angry. Very angry." She sat on the sofa, motioning for him to sit beside her. "I'm angry too. I'm hurt, disappointed. But carrying hatred for my own son will hurt me more than I've already been hurt. I'm choosing to try to forgive, because the alternative is to let this consume me from the inside out. Robert understood, even if he didn't completely agree. Everyone needed to process the situation in their own way. For her, forgiveness was a form of survival. For him, it would be a longer process. The days after Christmas brought a new routine. Joan began to adapt better to life in the apartment. She stopped hiding food under her pillow. She started sleeping better, though she still woke up disoriented occasionally. Maria returned from her trip and the two resumed their daily chats. The housekeeper suggested that Joan join a senior center in the neighborhood, a place where she could make friends, participate in activities, and have a social life. At first, Joan resisted. She thought she wouldn't fit in, that the other people were different from her, that they would judge her if they knew what she had been through. But Maria insisted, and so did Robert. Finally, she agreed to try. The first time she went to the center, she came back quiet. Robert expected it had gone badly, that she had felt out of place, but when he asked how it was, she surprised him. "It was good," she said, a tear rolling down her cheek. "One of the women there, Mrs. Rodriguez, told me she was also homeless for a while, years ago. She understands." Robert's chest tightened. How many stories like his mother's were out there? How many invisible people, discarded by their own families, were fighting to survive while the world passed by without noticing? In the following days, Joan asked for something Robert didn't expect. She wanted to go back to the place where everything started to fall apart. She wanted to revisit the street, in Astoria, where she had lived for so many years, where she had raised her sons, where she had been happy before everything changed. Robert hesitated. He was afraid it would be too painful for her. But Joan insisted. She said she needed to do it, needed to see where she came from to better understand where she was going. On a rainy January afternoon, they made the trip to Astoria. Robert drove through the narrow streets he no longer fully recognized. The neighborhood had changed in the years since he had left. New buildings, new shops, but the essence remained the same. When they reached the street where the family's old house was, Joan asked him to stop the car. "Will you walk with me?" They got out of the car and walked to the front of the house. It was different, painted a new color, with a fence out front that hadn't been there before. A different family lived there now, creating their own memories within the walls that had once held theirs. Joan stood on the sidewalk, looking at the house. "I spent 35 years here," she said softly. "I raised you two here. I cried a lot. I laughed a lot. This is where I learned to be strong when your father died. This is where I celebrated when you got into college. This is where it all began." "And where it all fell apart," Robert added. She shook her head. "No. This is where I became who I am. What fell apart wasn't this house. It was the idea that I needed it to have value. When I sold it, I thought I was losing my identity. But the truth is, I never needed walls to define me." They walked down the street, Joan pointing out places that held meaning. The bakery where she bought fresh bread every day, the school where the boys had studied, the park where she took them to play on Sundays. Each place carried memories, some happy, some painful. When they reached the park, she sat on a bench and watched the people go by. Mothers with children, elderly people chatting, young people rushing past. Life went on, indifferent to the individual stories of each person. "You know what I learned on the street, Robert?" she said, looking at the activity. "I learned that people don't disappear all at once. You disappear little by little. First you stop being seen by others, then you stop seeing yourself, and by the time you realize it, you're not there anymore." Robert sat beside her, not knowing what to say. "I had been disappearing for years," she continued, "long before I was on the street. Every time I swallowed my own needs so as not to be a bother. Every time I pretended everything was fine when it wasn't. Every time I accepted less than I deserved, because I thought that's what I was worth, I was disappearing. But you're here now," Robert said, holding her hand. "You're starting to reappear." Joan smiled, wiping away a tear. "I'm trying, but it's not easy. After being invisible for so long, It's hard to believe that anyone really wants to see you." "I want to see you, Mom, and I'll be here to remind you of that every day, as many times as it takes." They sat on that bench for almost an hour, just watching life happen around them. When they finally got up to go back to the car, Joan took one last look at her old house. "Thank you for bringing me." "Here, son." "You're welcome, Mum." On the way back, she was lighter, as if revisiting the past had given her permission to let some of it go and move forward. The following weeks brought small victories. Joan started participating more actively in the senior center. She made friends. She started laughing more. Robert watched her slowly transform back into something that resembled the woman he knew before everything fell apart. Not the same, it would never be the same, but a new version. A version that carried scars but also carried strength. Mark came to visit once a week. By first, the visits were tense, filled with uncomfortable silences, but over time they became more natural. He started his treatment for his gambling addiction, began paying small installments of the money he owed. It didn't erase the past, but it was a start. One day, 3 months after their reunion at the traffic light, Joan called Robert for a serious talk. They were on the balcony, having coffee and watching the city wake up. "I need to tell you something, son." Robert felt a tightness in his chest, fearing bad news. "I'm going to look for an apartment for myself." "What do you mean? You don't have to leave here." She placed her hand on his. "I know I don't have to, and I'm eternally grateful that you took me in. But I need to do this for myself. I need to prove to myself that I can live on my own again, that I can exist without being completely dependent on anyone." Robert was about to protest, but he saw the determination in her eyes. This wasn't about rejecting his help. It was about reclaiming her autonomy. It was about proving to herself that she was capable. "I'll help." "You look," he said finally, "and I'll be close by. Very close." Joan smiled. "I know, son. And that's what will make all the difference. Knowing I have you nearby, but being able to choose when to ask for help." They found a small apartment, just a few blocks from Robert's building. 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen. Simple but dignified. Robert furnished it completely, making sure she had everything she needed. On moving day, he stayed late helping her organize things. When everything was finally in place, they sat on the new sofa and looked around. "It's yours, Mom, all yours." She looked at the walls, at the furniture, at the space that was now hers. She cried, but they were different tears, not of pain, but of a new beginning. Months later, on a new Christmas, the family gathered at Joan's apartment. She had insisted on making dinner, even though Robert had offered to hire a catering service. The table was simple but plentiful. Turkey, rice, stuffing, the traditional recipes she used to make when the boys were little. Robert and Mark arrived together, bringing desserts and gifts. The relationship between the brothers was still complicated there. Were still hurts not fully healed, but they were trying. For her. For themselves. During dinner, Joan looked at her 2 sons and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Gratitude, not for the food, not for the roof over her head, but for being there, for having come back from the invisible, for having reclaimed the right to exist without apologizing. When they stood to make a toast, Robert gave a short speech. "To new beginnings, to second chances, to the family we almost lost but managed to save." They raised their glasses, and in that moment, under the modest lights of the small apartment, there was more genuine love than in all the luxurious Christmases Robert had ever experienced. Joan knew the journey wasn't over. She still had hard days, still woke up sometimes afraid it was all a dream. But she was also sure of one thing. She had survived the worst. She had looked invisibility in the eye and had chosen to come back. She had learned that disappearing was easy, but reappearing, reclaiming your space in the world, that took a courage she never knew she had. And on that Christmas night, surrounded by her imperfect but present sons, she understood that success wasn't about having a lot. It was about having enough. And she did. She finally did. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Joan, Robert and Mark has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of reunion, forgiveness and family reconstruction, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what resonated with you the most. How many families do we know that, like this one, have drifted apart in silence, where love was lost between pride, absence, and unspoken words? Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul, making us reflect on our own relationships and choices. We'll see you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions and make you think about what truly matters in life.